So let me move to conversion, but just recap a bit on caste. So one of the ways in which he's using caste as a model, or redefining it, is by, in a typical Gandhian fashion, criticizing what people took for granted. That sharing, sexual sharing and commensality is what defines a species. Gandhi condemns this sharing as being actually animal in character, and values non-sharing and non-exchange by pointing to the model of the family and friendship. So once you have friendship, you interdict sexual exchange generally, and certainly it's interdicted within the family. So he points to other institutions of social life and says, well, how about we think of, what happens when you think of these? What happens when you think about friendship and family? Are they to be excluded from the definitions of human, of species being? So let me move then from caste to conversion, and I'll continue this chain of thought. As with the abandonment of caste restrictions, Gandhi thought that the repudiation of religious identity constituted a false act of freedom, not least because it potentially reduced every particularity to a single universal faith. But his argument against conversion, which the Mahatma never went so far as to completely deny, proceeded in a slightly different direction from his defense of caste. So while religions like castes were all equal, they were also imperfect and therefore only in partial possession of the truth. As with castes, this made religions complementary rather than competitive and capable of learning from one another. But it also made conversion a crime against the truth, because in addition to regarding other religions as false, it sought to eliminate India's religious plurality, and with it, the very possibility of mutual learning or development. So the whole point is that religions all possess partial truth, and when you have different religious communities together, they can learn from each other, because none of them has the full truth. But if you have conversion, then learning stops, because you never encounter others. In a discussion with his old friend, the Anglican clergyman C.F. Andrews in 1936, Gandhi went on to describe more fully how the equality of religions and respect for them necessarily put conversion into question, quite apart from guaranteeing the increase of human knowledge and experience. Quote, "Supposing a Christian came to me and said he was captivated by a reading of the Bhagavata and so wanted to declare himself a Hindu, I should say to him, no, what Bhagavata offers, the Bible also offers. You have not made the attempt to find it out. We should, by living the life according to our light, share the best with one another, thus adding to the sum total of human effort to reach God. Consider whether you are going to accept the position of mutual toleration or of equality of all religions. My position is that all the great religions are fundamentally equal. We must have that innate respect for other religions as we have for our own. Mind you, not mutual toleration, but equal respect." Unquote. In a conversation with the missionary Dr. John Mott in 1929, Gandhi explained how his vision of religious equality precluded conversion. Quote, "I disbelieve in the conversion of one person by another. My effort should never be to undermine another's faith, but make him a better follower of his own faith. This implies belief in the truth of all religions and therefore respect for them. It again implies true humility and recognition of the fact that the divine light, having been vouchsafed to all religions through an imperfect medium of flesh, they must share in more or less degree the perfection of the vehicle." Unquote. The task of believers, in other words, was to strengthen each other's faith. But how was this possible without believing in another's religion oneself? Interesting about Gandhi's conception of moral relations was its refusal to base them upon any common belief or identity. Just as he refuses when thinking about caste. He refuses to consider exchange, sexual or commensal, as being defining of human solidarity. Whatever the truth shared among different sorts of believers then, he thought it should be possible for them to come together in mutual support without subsuming their differences within some larger unity, whether as Indians or indeed human beings. Although he did think that such larger unities existed, the Mahatma didn't take them as being universal. Like all conservatives, he also understood that it was both violent and in fact impossible to expect everyone or even most people, to render each other support on the basis of a shared belief or identity. And so the kind of moral relationship that consisted in strengthening another's belief without sharing it served for him as a crucial example of how one might live and act together without the universal. And you can see how this is related to his thoughts on caste. Apparently, equal but separate, you don't share, but you can still have a moral relationship. But it was not merely the violence or failure of truly universal identities that led to Gandhi's suspicion of them. Just as he thought religious diversity made learning and so the advancement of knowledge possible, so too did a pluralism unmediated by shared beliefs or agreements allow for unpredictable encounters that brought newness into the world. As the philosophical anarchist he often called himself, Gandhi was distrustful of all systems and totalities that, like imperialism, he considered deeply violent as well as ignorant and indeed vulnerable to overthrow in their a priori exclusions of the new and unexpected. So once you have difference, the new becomes possible. The unexpected becomes possible. The incalculable becomes possible, which a single religion or a single humanity would render impossible. Proceeding on the basis of prediction and calculation, such systematic forms of knowledge could only produce or prevent something already known, and were unable either to welcome or deal with the incalculable except in the mode of crisis. And yet, apart from being both inevitable and commonplace, it was often the incalculable that broke through the cycles of violence perpetuated by political or economic systems. Non-violent practices and forms of thinking were therefore meant to invite and accommodate the incalculable as representing freedom in the most immediate fashion, something that was capable of breaching systems or totalities like imperialism. This was at least in part why he focused on the rightness of means to the exclusion of ends, since a refusal to define action by a future known in advance, which is how we normally plan. Right? We plan our actions by saying, this is what we want to see in the future, and we need to work towards it. And Gandhi's argument, of course, is that that rarely works out. Even if it works out, you have a whole host of unpredictable and unexpected futures that come together with the one that you wanted. Instead, by focusing not on ends, but on means, on the rightness of your means, you leave the future open. And that allows for the incalculable, which he describes as, in good Vaishnava terms, as the avatar and the descent of Vishnu, the descent of God on earth. This was at least in part why he focused on the rightness of means to the exclusion of ends, since a refusal to define action by a future known in advance might welcome the incalculable in its morally charged figuration, which the Mahatmas sometimes describe as an avatar or incarnation of Vishnu. It was by dismissing the mediation, calculation, and predictability of systems that encounters are made possible, as well as moral rather than threatening in their signification. Perhaps the most important experiment Gandhi made in this way of encountering difference outside the commonalities upon which all systems were based came during the Khilafat movement that immediately followed the First World War. Indian Muslims who had contributed disproportionately to the war effort in the way of fighting men came to think that the British had betrayed them in seeking to strip the defeated Ottomans of Islam's sacred sites in the Middle East, as had been revealed in the initially secret Sykes-Picot Accord. Having indeed made such promises of non-interference to India's Muslims during the war, Britain, in Gandhi's opinion, had forfeited the loyalty of her subjects, both Muslim and Hindu. For the principle of neighborliness or Swadeshi took priority over the larger and more universal claims of imperial loyalty. And so whatever the failings of the Ottomans or the desires of their former Arab subjects, Hindus were obliged to support their Muslim neighbors against the British Empire until this wrong was righted. Equally important was the fact that Muslim belief in the Ottoman Sultan as Islam's caliph introduced a purely spiritual or ideal motive into Indian politics, one that couldn't be comprehended in materialistic terms as being about some property gained or lost. Unlike the usual religious disputes over mosques and temples that so often marred Hindu-Muslim relations. For the Indian Muslims had nothing to gain, they were not subjects of the Ottomans. Having spiritualized Indian politics by the very irrationality of their cause, therefore, Muslims offered their Hindu neighbors the possibility of idealizing their own actions by supporting the Khilafat movement, as Gandhi did by assuming its leadership. Leading to the most intense period of Hindu-Muslim unity since the revolt of 1857 against British rule, to which it was often compared, for a few years the Khilafat movement transformed Indian politics and social relations in a way no mere contractual relationship could, and all this without positing any shared belief among its supporters. So Gandhi is very clear. The Hindus will support the Muslims, but they don't believe in the Caliphate. You support your neighbor because he is your neighbor. You don't need to share a belief with that person. I shall return to the Khilafat movement when discussing the issue of cow protection, which became an important part of it. For just as Hindus were asked to support Muslims in a belief they didn't share, so too were the latter persuaded to abandon cow slaughter for the sake of their Hindu neighbors, even though they didn't believe in the animal's sanctity. And yet we shall see that Gandhi refused to make such mutual recognition into the basis of a deal, since this would simply render it into a contractual relationship that could only be temporary in nature, and certainly not the basis for a national unity, which he thought had to be unconditional. For our purposes, what is important here was Gandhi's recognition that the ineluctable diversity of motive and belief could result in an unprecedented manifestation of interreligious and so national unity, premised upon strengthening beliefs that one didn't share. So you see how the initial caste logic I set up, I hope you see, how the initial caste logic I set up has moved on to Gandhi's consideration of conversion, his distrust and his unwillingness to tolerate conversion from one religion to another. Though he never forbids it entirely, right? And one of the consequences of his distrust is his setting up of Indian pluralism as something more than merely social. It becomes part of a moral enterprise. So what the passages that I just read have to do with a discussion during the Khilafat movement when Muslim leaders come to Gandhi and they urge him to become the head of the Khilafat movement, which he did, the only Hindu to actually lead the greatest pan-Islamist movement ever in modern history, actually. Many of Gandhi's Hindu followers said, well, look, we can support them in the Caliphate, but then they need to support us as far as cow slaughter is concerned. And Gandhi said, this cannot be the matter of a deal. This is not a business contract. We must offer unconditional support to our neighbors, even and especially because we don't believe in their religion. We don't believe in the Caliphate. And if we do this, then the Muslims too will be brought to see that they need to respect our ideals, prejudices, or beliefs, even though they don't share them. So the whole point of a moral enterprise is that you don't require a kind of uniformity or universality. You don't need to share beliefs, just as at the level of caste, you don't need to share sexual partners or occupations or food. Right? He's taking a set of prescriptions that are hierarchical in their nature and trying to moralize them in a new way. Morally and intellectually, the chief problem Gandhi faced during the Khilafat movement was to prevent Hindu-Muslim relations from becoming merely contractual ones, in which the caliph and the cow could be traded for one another. And it was this tendency of the ideal or spiritual to be reduced to the stuff of ordinary politics and material engagements in general that informed the Mahatma's views about conversion. Christian missionaries, he thought, were betraying their own religion, or at least its spiritual dimension, because they were motivated by the desire to demean and destroy other faiths, while at the same time wanting to augment their own. In an article of 1935 published in his journal Harijan, for example, Gandhi wrote, quote, "But my trouble is that the missionary friends do not bring to their work a purely humanitarian spirit. Their object is to add numbers to their fold, and that is why they are disturbed. Some of the friends of a mission were the other day in high glee over the conversion to Christianity of a learned pundit. They had been dear friends, and so I told them that it was hardly proper to go into ecstasies over a man forsaking his religion, unquote. In order to get rid of any ulterior motive in religious activity, then the Mahatma recommended that to be truly Christian, the missionaries must, like he himself did, actively discourage conversion while performing their religiously mandated charitable duties. In this way, they would be rendering what he called humanitarian service to India without any hope of worldly reward. Or as he put it in another article of Harijan later that year, quote, "It is a conviction daily growing upon me that the great and rich Christian missions would render true service to India if they can persuade themselves to confine their activities to humanitarian service without the ulterior motive of converting India, or at least her unsophisticated villagers, to Christianity, and destroying their social superstructure, which, notwithstanding its many defects, has stood now for time immemorial the onslaughts upon it from within and from without," unquote. Arguably a Christian view of religion in its own right, the Mahatma's recommendation that its humanitarianism was only possible by renouncing any worldly advantage also followed from his understanding of the Gita as advocating action out of duty rather than desire. Even without this sacrificial vision of religious duty, however, he thought Christian missionaries had done service to Hinduism and Islam by the very competition they inspired, writing in a 1925 letter to a student who had inquired about proselytism that, quote, the indirect contribution on the other hand of Christian missionary effort is great. It has stimulated Hindu and Muslim religious research. It has forced us to put our houses in order. Unquote. Of course, even a purely humanitarian approach to religion, to religious duty, ran the risk of attracting converts. And so Gandhi ventured to suggest that faith could only be true to itself by forsaking even the communication of its doctrines. He's a very paradoxical character. And as with so many of his ideas, this one can also be seen as a self-serving method to render proselytism impossible. But I want to argue that there is something more interesting about Gandhi's distrust of language and communication here. So it's basically saying, missionaries, come do your work, run schools, hospitals, etc. This will be doing humanitarian service to India, and you will be performing your Christian duty. But don't convert anyone. If you refuse to convert someone, you will be truly Christian. And in the effort not to convert anyone, you actually refuse to put forward your doctrines. There's a kind of refusal of language, which I want to talk about. Now, already in the introduction to his autobiography, the Mahatma had written that while happy to deliver his life up to scrutiny, his relations with God were by their very nature incommunicable. In other words, language was always insufficient to convey religious knowledge or experience. Indeed, it could only ever betray. Language could only ever betray religious experience and conviction, could never really communicate it. And though religion provided the chief example of such an incommunicable phenomenon, it was not the only one, with Gandhi on occasion making it clear that he had very little inkling even about his wife's thoughts and intentions. It was this radical ignorance, due not to imperfect communication, but the everyday limits of knowledge, that the Mahatma prized as another kind of defense against the lure of universality. So now, in addition to sex and commensality, he's talking about language. And language, of course, is one of the crucial classical definitions of the human being, that person who has language or thought. So Gandhi, in a typically contrarian fashion, goes instead to the incommunicable or to the non-communicative. Indeed, he frequently rehearsed such incommunicability in his days of silence, which were not meant to prevent conversation or dialogue, since he continued to read and write letters, so much as detract from and cast doubt upon its all-encompassing ambition to unite humanity and resolve its conflicts. So Gandhi had his days of silence, and he would write, he wouldn't speak. And in part, I think what he was doing was suggesting, let's not place so much emphasis on these conventional ideas, that language will solve everything, that communication will bring us all together and unify us. Just as he didn't think that sexual congress or commensality could either. Instead of language, Gandhi advocated exemplary behavior as the best way to demonstrate the truth of any faith. Since he well knew that no religious community could exist without language, the Mahatma clearly wasn't recommending all believers to remain forever silent about their faith, but only pointing to alternative and, he thought, more religious ways of making God known to others as much as oneself. Moral example, or living by one's belief, was of course something that Gandhi constantly preached, and his own life was meant to display such faith wordlessly as its surest proof. When speaking about conversion then, he repeatedly used the image of the rose, whose scent alone served as the proof. Excuse me. Delhi really defeats me, as you can see. So he uses the image of the rose, which is only known by its fragrance. In a conference of the Missionary Society of London in 1931, for instance, he claimed, quote, "The idea of converting people to one's faith by speech and writings, by appeal to reason and emotion, and by suggesting that the faith of his forefathers is a bad faith, is, in my opinion, limits the possibilities of serving humanity. Religion is like a rose. It throws out the scent which attracts like a magnet, and we are drawn to it involuntarily, not by communication. Only an exemplary life in accordance with one's religious beliefs, therefore, was capable either of strengthening the faith of a co-religionist or legitimately converting someone from another community. And all this in a non-violent fashion, because it didn't rely upon hypocrisy, polemics, demeaning the beliefs of others, or inducements of any material kind. You simply live your religion, and that demonstrates it. You don't speak it. As he put it in an article of 1927 in Young India, the incommunicability of religions by way of language also entailed the refusal to describe and compare them. Quote, "I do not believe in people telling others of their faith, especially with a view to conversion. Faith does not admit of telling. It has to be lived, and then it becomes self-propagating. Nor do I consider myself fit to interpret Hinduism except through my own life. And if I may not interpret Hinduism through my written word, I may not compare it with Christianity." Unquote. Yet the Mahatma's suspicion of language went beyond these still fairly prosaic concerns. After all, by criticizing its ambitions, he was casting doubt upon one of the most important definitions of humanity, which is to say the classical description of man as a speaking or reasoning animal. To be fully human, or at least humanitarian, Gandhi suggested, meant foregoing language. As we have seen, with the idea of choice as a moral principle, language and the knowledge it requires traded on a false universality. For instead of uniting all human beings, language actually divided them into unequal classes, both of individuals and groups, based on their rhetorical and analytical skills. In the same way that Gandhi considered sacrifice rather than knowledge a moral principle available to everyone, so too was example preferable to communication in his eyes. And yet, as with sacrifice, example wasn't simply universal as the lowest common denominator of moral life, but in fact was far more demanding while being at the same time more common. Its universality, if the term can even be used here, was negative or rather non-universal, without being particular in both cases, constituted by acts of renunciation rather than appropriation. Perhaps the most controversial instance of Gandhi's distrust of communication came during a discussion of low-caste conversions to Christianity, Islam, or Sikhism. Responding in 1936 to the Dalit leader B.R. Ambedkar's threat to leave Hinduism and take his caste fellows with him, the Mahatma wrote in Harijan that, quote, "The poor Harijans have no mind, no intelligence, no sense of difference between God and no God. It is absurd for a single individual to talk of taking all the Harijans with himself. Are they all bricks that they can be moved from one structure to another?" Unquote. On the one hand, then, Gandhi held Dalits to be, for the most part, too ignorant to understand religious doctrines. No doubt because of their oppression by caste, upper caste. And on the other, he saw in Ambedkar's promise to take them with him out of Hinduism as an exploitation of this same ignorance. Having been accused of impugning the intelligence of Dalits, the Mahatma spoke again the following month to press home his point that those who would add these castes to their fold were in fact the ones who not only recognized their ignorance but exploited it as well. Quote, "It hurts me to find Christian bodies vying with the Muslims and Sikhs in trying to add to the numbers of their fold. It seemed to me an ugly performance and a travesty of religion. They even proceeded to enter into secret conclaves with Dr. Ambedkar. I should have understood and appreciated your prayers for the Harijans, but instead you made an appeal to those who had not even the mind and intelligence to understand what you taught. They have certainly not the intelligence to distinguish between Jesus and Muhammad and Nanak and so on. Will you preach the gospel? Will you preach of gospel to a cow? Well, some of the untouchables are worse than cows in understanding. I mean, they can no more distinguish between the relative merits of Islam and Hinduism and Christianity than can a cow. You can only preach through your life. The rose does not say, 'Come and smell me.'" So I've deliberately chosen these quite extreme quotations from Gandhi, and he was condemned for them in his own lifetime. Offering Dalits religion as a way of liberating them from caste oppression, Gandhi seemed to suggest, was to make conversion into a material inducement for which its doctrines were of little account and merely symbolic. Language and its communicative dimension, in other words, worked here only to impoverish experience, if not conceal its bitter truth with a false spirituality. Against this competition among Christian, Muslim, Sikh and Buddhist missionaries to convert Dalits by currying favor with Ambedkar, the Mahatma proposed the embarrassment of language for moral example. Which, by moral example, he saw as the only serious form in which proselytism could occur. You don't speak your religion, you perform it. Only this approach imposed the duty of sacrifice or restraint upon the missionary in place of a purely economic consideration of numerical gain, and so kept him true to his own faith. The point then is the missionary has to be kept true to his own faith. In view of the furor that resulted from Gandhi comparing Dalits to cows, he was forced to respond again a few months later in 1937, arguing that he hadn't meant any offense and didn't consider Dalit ignorance of religious doctrine to be congenital, but a result rather of their miserable condition, quote. "But I hold that my comparison was as innocuous as it was appropriate. It was innocuous because of the unique place the cow occupies in India. It was appropriate because in the matter of understanding the presentation of Christianity, the ordinary Harijan can no more take it in than the cow. That the dullest Harijan can be trained to understand it in course of time, whereas the cow never can, is irrelevant for